She screamed like she'd seen a ghost, but it wasn't a ghost. It was a 20-po lb buck rabbit charging at her in broad daylight, ears pinned back like a linebacker, and eyes locked on her like a heat-seeking missile. And all this because she couldn't stop stealing feed that didn't belong to her. It had started out like any other morning. The sun was rising over the ridge, casting that perfect orange glow across the back pasture. I was sipping my coffee, listening to the birds chirp and the low hum of cicadas. Peaceful, predictable. Then I noticed something strange near the hutch. The feed bin was lighter, not empty, but noticeably depleted. Again, I had just filled it the day before. At first, I thought maybe the rabbits were eating more. Maybe hot weather had boosted their appetite, but the numbers didn't add up. I had 6 Flemish giants, and even on a heavy day, they couldn't eat through 20 lbs overnight. Something was off. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was raccoons. Maybe a neighbor's kid getting curious. But deep down, I had a feeling it was Karen. She was the type of person who thought everything in the neighborhood should be hers to monitor, adjust, or borrow without asking. She wore her HOA badge like a sheriff's star and treated every mailbox, fence, and garden like it was under her domain. The first time she showed up at my place, she told me the rabbit hutch violated visual uniformity standards and that my bin for feed was an unapproved external container. I asked her to show me the regulation. She couldn't. She just huffed, turned on her heel, and walked back to her perfectly paved sidewalk. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, the feed had gone missing. Twice. Subtle, like she didn't want to be obvious. Maybe she figured I was too country to notice a scoop or two missing from a 50 lb bag. But I wasn't raised to overlook patterns. I started checking the bin every morning, marking the levels. I even placed a twig under the lid, knowing it would fall if someone opened it. Sure enough, the twig was on the ground again this morning. No storm, no wind. Someone had been here, and it wasn't wildlife. I decided it was time to confirm my suspicion. I had an old trail cam I used during deer season, still functional, just dusty. I cleaned it, set it up facing the hutch, and angled it to catch anyone approaching the bin. The next morning, the twig was gone. The feed was lower. I checked the footage. There she was, Karen. Flip-flops, floral print pajamas, and a reusable grocery bag over her shoulder. She crept up like a raccoon in lipstick, lifted the bin lid like it was hers, and scooped out feed like she was shopping for granola. Then she strutted away without a care in the world. I didn't confront her. Not yet. That wasn't my style. There was a better way to handle someone like Karen. I had a secret weapon in my barn. His name was Hercules. Most folks think of rabbits as small, soft creatures who nibble on carrots and hop around in the grass. But Hercules wasn't most rabbit. He was a Flemish giant buck, nearly the size of a cocker spaniel, with the attitude of a junkyard dog. He was gentle with me and the kids, but fiercely territorial with strangers. If anyone approached the hutch uninvited, he'd thump loud enough to rattle your knees. Once, he even chased off a stray dog that got too close. People laughed when I told them I had a guard rabbit. They weren't laughing after they met him. I made a few adjustments to the hutch. I rigged the side latch to release Hercules if someone opened the feed bin during his active hours. He was smart. He understood commands, followed patterns, and, when released, he didn't run away. He ran at whatever disturbed his space. All I had to do was wait. The next morning came. Nothing happened. The morning after? Same. But then came the third morning. I heard the faint sound of the bin lid creaking. I looked out of the kitchen window. There she was again, hunched over, scoop in hand. Then came the latch. A small click, a pause, then thunder. Hercules shot out of the hutch like a bullet. Karen shrieked so loud it spooked a flock of birds off the power line. She dropped her bag and stumbled backward into my flower bed. Hercules didn't bite. He didn't need to. He charged, thumped, and stood his ground right between her and the bin. Karen tried to sidestep him, and he followed her like a shadow, nose twitching, ears locked on target. She turned to run. He followed. She made it to the fence, scrambled over it like her life depended on it, and landed face first on the other side. Her slipper got caught in the wire mesh, and dangled there like a flag of surrender. I stepped out onto the porch and took a long sip of my coffee. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. Karen looked back at me from the sidewalk, disheveled, red-faced and speechless. Hercules stood behind her on my side of the fence, ears up, watching like a bouncer at a nightclub. That was the moment it all shifted. Karen thought she ran the neighborhood. She thought her rules, her letters, and her little power plays would keep everyone in check. But she'd made one mistake too many. She underestimated a rabbit, and she forgot who actually owned the land beneath her shoes. As she limped back home, muttering something about animal control, I downloaded the footage and saved a still frame of her mid-sprint, arms flailing, tote bag flying through the air. I didn't send it to anyone. Not yet. But I had a feeling this wasn't the end. It was just the opening act. 2 days passed in perfect, suspicious silence. Not a single HOA letter showed up on my doorstep, which was its own kind of red flag. Karen was many things, but silent wasn't one of them. I half expected a formal complaint pinned to my gate about Hercules being a dangerous animal, or some nonsense about violating pet regulations. But nothing came. No email, no warning, not even one of those smug HOA newsletters with her signature at the bottom. That kind of quiet didn't come without planning, and Karen wasn't the type to walk away after humiliation. No, she was regrouping, probably sharpening her claws and rewriting the neighborhood codebook just to strike back harder. On the third morning, a white envelope finally appeared, tucked into my mailbox. It was folded like a legal notice and stamped with the HOA letterhead. I didn't even need to open it to know it was bad news. I sat down at the kitchen table, opened it with my pocket knife, and read it slow. Violation notice. Improper containment of livestock. Unapproved feed storage. Visual disharmony. They even managed to squeeze in a noise complaint, which made no sense because Hercules didn't bark, honk, or crow. At most, he thumped the ground like a tribal drum, and only when necessary. According to the letter, I had exactly 10 days to remove the hutch, secure the feed in an enclosed structure, and if I wanted to keep the rabbits, I would need to submit a formal livestock exemption application with photos and HOA approval. I sat back in my chair, letting the paper drop to the table. There it was, Karen's retaliation. She had wrapped her petty theft in red tape and tried to turn the neighborhood against me. The irony was thick enough to spread on toast. She stole my feed, got chased off by a rabbit, and now she was trying to call me the problem. I figured it was time to gather some intel, and I knew just the man to ask. Earl lived 2 houses down. A retired Army vet with a limp, a permanent tan, and the sharpest eyes in the neighborhood. He knew everything before it happened. If a squirrel so much as twitched in the wrong tree, Earl already knew about it. I walked over that afternoon with a 6-pack of root beer, his favorite, and asked him what he'd heard about the incident. Earl laughed so hard I thought he was going to pull something in his back. Apparently, the video of Karen getting chased by Hercules had made it to one of the local Facebook group. Someone had titled it, Bunny vs. HOA Tyrant. She was a meme. Now there were edited clips of Hercules with boxing gloves, some with theme, music, and one where someone had replaced Karen's scream with a goat bleed. The internet, as always, was undefeated, but not everyone was laughing. According to Earl, Karen had gathered a few of her more loyal HOA board members and was talking about emergency regulation changes. She was lobbying to introduce a weight limit for backyard animals. Anything over 10 lbs would be considered livestock and subject to stricter regulations. The rule would eliminate larger dog breeds, big cats, and of course, Flemish giant rabbits like Hercules. It was obvious who the rule targeted, but she was spinning it as a safety concern. Earl shook his head and took another sip of his root beer. "She's gone full dictator," he said. "Someone needs to remind her. This ain't a gated kingdom." Later, that evening, I got a knock on the door. It was Linda, one of the other board members, holding a plate of banana bread and looking more nervous than a raccoon caught in headlights. She said she didn't agree with what Karen was doing, and wanted to warn me that the HOA board was planning a surprise inspection later in the week. Linda had raised chickens once before. Karen pressured her to remove the coop. Since then, she had kept her head down, but the rabbit incident had changed something. Karen's behavior was starting to embarrass the board. I thanked her for the warning and accepted the banana bread, which was surprisingly good. That night, I stood out on the porch and watched Hercules stretch in the moonlight, hopping in lazy arcs across the yard. He didn't know he'd become the neighborhood's most famous rabbit. Or maybe he did. He had a strut to him now, like he knew he'd earned a reputation. But I also knew the fight wasn't over. Karen wasn't just going to retreat. She was the type who needed control, like some people needed oxygen. If she couldn't win through intimidation or embarrassment, she'd try it through policy. That inspection they were planning wouldn't be casual. They'd come with clipboards, tape measures, and printed codebooks ready to interpret things however they pleased. I had to be prepared. I moved the feed into my barn, which had a lockable section I hadn't used in months. I cleaned up the hutch, gave it a fresh coat of paint, and surrounded it with potted plants to make it blend in. Everything neat, compliant, but still ready for a fight. The morning before the inspection, I got one more visit. This time from a neighbor I barely knew, a man named Dave who lived 3 streets over. He had seen the video and stopped by just to shake my hand. He said watching Karen run like a cartoon villain made his whole week. Apparently, she had tried to find him for a cracked flower pot last month. Word was getting around. The neighborhood was waking up. Karen's grip was slipping, but I also understood that cornered animals were the most dangerous. And Karen, for all her polished words and HOA forms, was about to be backed into one. She had embarrassed herself, tried to rewrite the rules to punish me, and failed to get the board fully behind her. Now her only chance at regaining control would be a show of force during the inspection. I was ready. Hercules was ready. The cameras were rolling. Let her bring her rules and her rulers. We were about to show her that not everything on this side of the fence was hers to control. The morning of the inspection arrived with a sky so clear it almost felt sarcastic. I stood on my porch, arms folded, coffee in hand, watching the HOA procession approach like a neighborhood parade no one asked for. Karen was in front naturally, clipboard clutched in one hand, oversized sunglasses perched on her nose like she was trying to hide from recognition, or perhaps from the memory of being chased by a buck rabbit. Behind her were 2 other board members, both walking stiffly, like they didn't particularly want to be there. One was Linda, who gave me a barely noticeable nod as she passed through the front gate. The other was Todd, a man whose main contributions to the HOA meetings were grunts and half-finished thoughts. They didn't speak when they entered the yard. Karen raised her clipboard and started scribbling, scanning the property like she was appraising it for sale. Her eyes lingered on the freshly painted hutch, the flower pots arranged neatly, the feed nowhere in sight. Everything looked tidy, ordinary, and unremarkable, just how I wanted it. I had even gone the extra step of cleaning the windows and trimming the hedges the night before. The place looked like a postcard. But the best part wasn't the setup. The best part was what she couldn't see. Hercules was inside the hutch, perfectly calm, lying in a shaded corner like a cat who had already eaten his mouse. I had removed the latch mechanism for the day just in case. As satisfying as it would be to watch her get chased again, this was about strategy now. Let her try to find a violation. Let her try to twist something out of nothing. I was ready to play the game by the book, and I had reread the entire HLA handbook just to make sure there were no loopholes she could exploit. Every measurement was exact. Every bin, container, and structure had been moved within the allowed parameters. Even the wind chimes had been taken down to avoid noise complaint. Karen walked a slow circle around the hutch, inspecting it like it might sprout legs and run. She made notes. Lots of notes. Then she turned to the group and said something too. Quiet for me to hear. Linda didn't respond. Todd shrugged. Karen turned to me then, her voice loud and clip. She asked if the rabbits were still housed here, as if the presence of the hutch didn't already answer that question. I nodded and said yes, but reminded her that there were no active violations under the current code. She tried to counter, saying that an animal over 10 lb constituted livestock and therefore needed special licensing. I politely asked her to show me where in the bylaws that distinction was made. She said it was in review for a vote next week. I said until it passed. It wasn't enforceable. The conversation paused there. An awkward silence stretched between us as Karen realized she had no real move to make. Then she pivoted. She asked if she could take photos for documentation. I agreed, on the condition that I also document her presence on my property with video. I reached into my pocket and held up my phone, camera already recording. Her smile froze, then faded. She took the pictures anyway. As they finished their inspection and started toward the sidewalk, I noticed something unexpected. Hercules was now sitting upright in his hutch, ears forward, watching Karen like he remembered every detail of their last encounter. She noticed, too. Her steps quickened. By the time she reached the gate, her face was red. Whether from heat or frustration, I couldn't tell. Once they were out of earshot, I went inside and replayed the footage from my hidden yard cameras. Everything was crystal clear. No aggressive behavior, no violations, just a quiet yard, a few photos taken, and one HOA president clearly itching to find something that wasn't there. Later that afternoon, I received a copy of the inspection report via email. It was a mess. Karen had tried to cite the rabbits for potential soil disruption and attractants for predators. She claimed the Hutch design posed a tripping hazard and that the rabbits themselves were contributing to a decline in neighborhood harmony. I almost laughed reading it, but what really caught my eye was the recommendation section. She had drafted a formal proposal to amend the HOA bylaws, specifically adding weight restrictions to domestic animals and placing limits on backyard enclosures. It was as targeted as a laser beam. If passed, the rule would outlaw Hercules by weight, the hutch by dimensions, and likely the flower pots by some invented aesthetic clause. What Karen didn't know was that several neighbors had already started speaking out. Linda had quietly passed around screenshots of the video from the rabbit chase. The community Facebook page was flooded with comment. People were calling her power, hungry, excessive, and a poor example of leadership. Some even joked that the rabbit should run for HOA president. It would have been funny if it wasn't so serious, because now this was more than just Karen and me. She had made it personal, and in doing so, she had woken up a group of people who had tolerated her antics for too long. That evening, I walked out to the hutch and gave Hercules a fresh carrot. He sniffed it, gave one long thump, and started chewing slowly like a king enjoying his victory feast. I sat beside him, leaning against the fence, thinking about what came next. Karen wasn't backing down. Her proposal was already scheduled for discussion at the next HOA meeting, and she would push hard, playing on fear, order, and community standards to sway the vote. But what she didn't expect was resistance, not just from me, but from others. Linda, Earl, Dave, even Todd, who never said much, had started to frown more often when Karen talked. People were tired. Tired of the pettiness, the rules used as weapons, the fake concern for safety, when the real motive was control. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the lawn, I realized something. This wasn't about a rabbit. It never really had been. It was about standing up when someone thinks they can walk all over you just because they have a clipboard and a title. It was about reminding people that communities aren't meant to be ruled. They're meant to be lived in. And no rule, no vote, and no power trip from Karen was going to change that. I went inside that night and sent out a message to every neighbor I could think of. Simple, direct, informal. It said, "There's a meeting coming up, and I hope you'll be there. Bring your voice. Bring your questions. Let's talk about what really matters." And just for good measure, I attached a still shot from the footage of Karen mid-sprint with Hercules in hot pursuit, because if nothing else, people deserve a reminder of how this all started. With a tote bag full of stolen feed and a rabbit who refused to back down. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, the neighborhood was buzzing. Not with lawnmowers or barking dogs or kids playing tag, but with quiet conversations over fences and messages shared between mailboxes. Karen had triggered something deeper than she expected. Her usual tactics of quiet enforcement and veiled threats weren't working anymore. People were starting to connect the dots to remember every little moment when they felt targeted, policed, or silenced. All those small incidents, letters about the color of their patio chairs, warnings about leaving trash cans visible, fines over the height of hedges, were now stitched together in the shadow of one ridiculous rabbit chase. Hercules had become more than a buck. He had become a symbol, and Karen had no idea how loud a neighborhood could get when it stopped being afraid of her. I arrived at the meeting early, not because I wanted a good seat, but because I wanted to watch how the room filled up. Usually, these meetings had maybe 10 people, most of them the same faces every month. That night, there were over 30 couples, retirees, a few young parents holding toddlers, even some teenagers tagging along. People who never showed up were now showing up in full force. Karen was already at the front of the room, standing behind a fold-out table like she was hosting a seminar. Her laptop was open, a stack of printed agendas neatly arranged beside her. She didn't look up as people entered. She didn't greet anyone. She just clicked her pen and stared down at her notes like the sheer force of her handwriting could hold the room in place. The meeting began with the usual introductions. Karen read the minutes from the last session, skipping over the part where she had tried to cite me for a noise complaint triggered by a thumping rabbit. Then she launched into the new business section. That was when she brought it out, a draft of the proposed amendment to the HOA bylaws. She spoke clearly like a news anchor, explaining that due to recent incidents involving aggressive animal behavior and potential threats to safety, she was recommending an immediate restriction on backyard animals exceeding 10 adult lads. She didn't. Name Hercules. She didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew exactly who the rule was aimed at. Her voice was calm, but her eyes scanned the room like a lifeguard watching for rip currents. The silence that followed was heavy. She seemed to take that as approval. She turned to Todd and asked him to second the motion. Todd opened his mouth, closed it, then said he thought the rule needed further discussion. Karen froze for half a second, then nodded stiffly and opened the floor for public comment. That was when Linda stood up. Linda didn't raise her voice. She didn't even move to the front. She just stood from her seat, banana bread container in her lap, and calmly told the room what she had seen. She said that Karen had used the bylaws to bully multiple neighbors. She reminded everyone about the flower pot fines, the kids who had been scolded for sidewalk chalk, the flags that had been declared non-compliant, and of course, the rabbit feed theft. Then she pulled out her phone and played the now infamous video of Karen being chased by Hercules. The room erupted in quiet laughter. Karen tried to interject, claiming the video was taken without permission, but Linda shut her down. This wasn't about the video. This was about how she had weaponized her authority for personal grudges. More people started to speak. Dave brought up how Karen had accused him of installing a birdhouse too close to his fence. An elderly woman near the back said she was fined for having a wreath on her door out of season. A young couple said they were threatened with penalties for planting vegetables in pots instead of raised bed. Story after story poured out like water breaking through a dam. Every sentence chipped away at the wall Karen had built around her power. She tried to regain control, raising her hand, tapping the microphone, reminding everyone that she was still president. But it was like the volume of the room swallowed her. One neighbor stood and asked when the next vote for board positions would be held. Another asked if a special vote could be held to revise leadership. Karen's face pad. This wasn't just resistance. This was revolt. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get better, Earl stood up. He leaned on his cane, cleared his throat, and in that slow, growly voice of his, said that he had served in places where authority meant survival, not intimidation. He said Karen didn't know the difference. He ended his speech with one line. That rabbit has more integrity than this entire board. The room applauded. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, and it rattled Karen more than anything else that night. The meeting ended in chaos. no vote was taken on her new rule. Instead, a motion was submitted to call a special session to review leadership performance and consider new elections. Karen didn't say goodbye. She just packed up her laptop and walked out, her heels echoing down the hallway like punctuation on a chapter she never meant to write. I walked home under a quiet sky. The stars were out, and the night air felt lighter than it had in weeks. When I reached the gate, Hercules was sitting by the hutch, ears up, nose twitching like he had sensed the shift. I crouched down and gave him a slow pat between the ears. He leaned into it, his body warm and calm. In his own way, he had started something bigger than both of us. All I did was give him the space to do it. Back inside, I checked my messages. A few neighbors had already texted thanking me for standing up, for not backing down. Someone had even made a new meme. Karen's face mid-sprint with the caption, "The HOA wanted a fight. The rabbit brought a revolution." I laughed until my ribs hurt, but I knew it wasn't over. Karen wouldn't just disappear. People like her always had a backup plan, always found new ways to spin their version of the truth. She would try again. She would dig in. But this time, she would find herself alone. No loyal board, no silent neighbors, just a community that had finally remembered what it meant to have a voice and a rabbit who still guarded the hutch. The morning after the HOA meeting felt different. The kind of different you feel when a storm passes and the sky doesn't look quite the same. People were waving more. A neighbor I barely knew honked and gave me a thumbs up as I walked down the driveway to grab the mail. Even Linda stopped by with a fresh loaf of banana bread. This one wrapped with a little note that simply read, "Thanks for speaking up." Hercules, now something of a local celebrity, had been getting visitors too. Kids stopped by to see the famous bunny who had chased the HOA president into viral fame, and adults came just to laugh about it all over again. But while the neighborhood was beginning to loosen its shoulders, I knew better than to assume peace had fully arrived. Karen had been humiliated, outvoted, and publicly exposed. But someone like her didn't just crawl away quietly. She'd come, back around, not with a shout, but with a whisper and a clipboard. Sure enough, by the end of that week, I spotted something new across the street. Mounted to the HOA signpost was a small surveillance camera pointing directly at my property. Not angled broadly across the street, not covering the neighborhood entrance. No, it was clearly focused on my yard. I walked across the road and examined it. The wiring was shoddy, likely a rush job, and it didn't bear any professional branding, just a tiny green light blinking like an accusation. I took a picture of it and sent it to Linda. Her response came within minutes. Karen installed it herself. No vote, no board approval. She said it was for safety monitoring. That was all I needed to hear. I didn't touch the camera. Instead, I made sure it had something to record. That afternoon, I set up a little scene for it. Hercules got a fresh bed of hay. His water bowl was scrubbed till it sparkled, and I made sure to sit out by the hutch sipping tea while reading the HOA handbook aloud, page by page, into the open air. At one point, I even waved to the camera. If Karen wanted answer to provide. 1. But then, something happened that tipped everything into new territory. I was checking the footage from my own security system later that evening when I noticed movement near the corner of my yard. It was Karen. Not during daylight, not during her walks. This was after 9, creeping through the side like a raccoon in a pantsuit. She stopped near the hutch, crouched down, and appeared to be fiddling with something. The footage was grainy, in the low light, but I could clearly see her lifting the hatch slightly and sprinkling something near the base. Then she turned and walked back to the sidewalk, her pace quick, her head darting side to side like a kid who knows they did something wrong. I didn't sleep much that night. My thoughts were tangled between anger and disbelief. This had gone beyond inspections and policy proposals. She had stepped into my yard, touched the hutch, possibly tampered with something. I checked Hercules first thing in the morning. He was fine, calm, healthy. Whatever she had done hadn't harmed him. But that wasn't the point. The point was she was escalating. That tiny green light on the camera suddenly felt like the blinking eye of someone who thought they still had control. I pulled the footage, backed it up, and made 3 copies. One went to Linda, one I kept for myself. The third I delivered directly to the HOA Ethics Committee via a thumb drive taped to a printed statement, outlining everything from the stolen feed to the unapproved surveillance and now the potential trespassing. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Within 48 hours, the HOA Ethics Committee issued a notice suspending Karen from her presidential duties pending investigation. The board met privately and reviewed the footage. By the end of the week, another letter went out to the entire neighborhood. Effective immediately, Karen was placed under official censure. Her camera was to be removed. A special election was scheduled. It was over, or at least her reign was. That weekend, I received something unexpected. A box left quietly on my porch. No name, no note. Inside was a bag of the same rabbit feed Karen had stolen weeks ago. It was unopened, sealed, and sitting right on top was the broken latch she had fiddled with during her nighttime visit. I stared at it for a while, unsure whether it was an apology or a final act of guilt. Either way, I wasn't touched by the gesture. It came too late. The damage had been done, not just to me, but to the trust the neighborhood once had in her. After the camera was removed, things shifted fast. The Facebook group, once a quiet board for garage sales and lost pets, was now full of posts about transparency, community events, and nominations for new leadership. Hercules had his own fan club. Someone even made stickers with his face and the words "Neighborhood Security" printed underneath. What started as a petty theft had unraveled into a full-blown reshaping of our community dynamic. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the trees, I sat on the porch with a cold drink in one hand and watched Hercules hop lazily across the yard. No alarms, no creeping shadows, no blinking cameras, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a long, ridiculous storm. He stopped beside the hutch, gave it a nudge with his nose, then flopped over in the grass like a cat who knew he'd done his part. I leaned back and smiled. We didn't have to raise our voices. We didn't have to get nasty. We just had to stand our ground and let the truth speak louder than the noise. The neighborhood had changed, and not just because Karen had been silenced. It had changed because people remembered they had a say. They remembered that rules were meant to serve, not control. And every time someone saw Hercules hopping across the yard, they remembered how one rabbit reminded an entire block that dignity doesn't have a title and respect can't be demanded from a clipboard. It's earned step by step, carrot by carrot, one quiet act of courage at a time. The special election was scheduled for the following Thursday, and you could feel the buzz across the whole neighborhood. For once, folks who used to avoid anything, labeled HOA, were now swapping stories over fences and comparing notes on board candidates like it was the county fair. People who had been silent for years were stepping forward, not to cause trouble, but to finally have a say in how things were run. No one was talking about lawn lengths or mailbox colors anymore. They were talking about trust, fairness, and how ridiculous it had become that a single person managed to turn an entire community into a place of fear. Karen's name had turned from a figure of authority into the punchline of every front yard conversation. And at the center of it all, somehow still thumping along with his big ears and heavier than average attitude, was Hercules. On the day of the vote, I saw more neighbors gathered at the clubhouse than I ever had before. People brought folding chairs, coolers, and even snacks like it was a picnic. Linda was one of the main candidates, and her platform was simple. No more rule twisting, no more power grabs. She wasn't just popular because she had stood up to Karen. She was popular because she had kept banana bread in the loop and had taken the time to listen. Other candidates emerged too, like Earl, who vowed to remove unnecessary surveillance and shift focus from fines to real improvement project. It was the first time the board actually felt like a group of neighbors instead of an enforcement squad. Karen showed up near the start of the vote wearing a plain white blouse and dark sunglasses. She stood in the back, arms crossed, not speaking to anyone. She looked smaller than I remembered, not in size, but in presence. No one greeted her. No one acknowledged her. Her clipboard was gone. Her smugness had vanished. She watched the proceedings in silence, waiting for an opportunity that never came. The voting took place calmly, and the results were tallied the same evening. Linda won by a landslide. Earl was voted in as vice president, and Todd, to everyone's surprise, was kept on the board as treasurer. He seemed shocked by it, but smiled quietly when the results were announced. Later that night, as the new board made a short speech thanking everyone for their support, Karen stood and walked out without a word. There was no outburst, no goodbye, just the sound of her shoes tapping across the clubhouse floor. That was the last time I saw her at any community event, but her shadow still lingered like an old odor clinging to the walls after you repaint. 2 days after the election, I received a certified letter in the mail. It was from Karen. She had filed a complaint in small claims court for emotional distress. In her statement, she alleged that the rabbit had intentionally caused her harm, and that my security footage being shared online had damaged her public reputation. She also claimed that her fall over the fence left a bruise on her hip and emotional trauma that prevented her from walking the neighborhood comfortably. It was so absurd. I had to reread it twice just to confirm it wasn't a prank. I didn't panic. I just called my attorney. I handed him the security footage, copies of HOA notices, the inspection report, and screenshots of Karen herself tampering with the hutch on my property. I didn't need to embellish anything. The facts told the story better than any argument could. When the court date arrived, the judge reviewed everything and raised an eyebrow after watching Karen run from Hercules in grainy black and white. He looked at her, then at me, then leaned forward and asked a single question. "Is this the rabbit in question?" I nodded. The judge asked if there were any documented injuries. Karen pulled out a photo of a bruise so minor it could have been from bumping a coffee table. The judge sighed, set down the folder, and dismissed the case with the kind of tone that suggested he was done entertaining nonsense for the day. After the hearing, I walked out into the sunshine, my shoulders lighter than they had been in weeks. The ridiculous saga had finally reached its courtroom finale, and I hadn't even needed to speak much. Truth had done the heavy lifting. That afternoon, when I returned home, I found another note on my porch. This time, it wasn't from Karen. It was from Linda. She had included a printed invitation to a neighborhood celebration event. No formal agenda, just good food, games for kids, and a community toast. At the bottom, someone had scribbled, "Bring Hercules." The party was held on the green lot near the old basketball hoop, and nearly every household showed up. There were lawn chairs lined in circles, barbecue grills smoking up ribs and corn, and kids chasing one another with chalk-stained hand. People came not just to eat, but to reconnect. Someone had set up a poster board titled "What Karen Tried to Ban," and neighbors had pinned up photos of things she once cited. Wind chimes, garden gnomes, flags, seasonal wreaths, and of course a big picture of Hercules in his best pose. The whole thing had the feel of a reunion more than a meeting. People were laughing again, talking again, living again. I brought Hercules on a leash, not because he needed it, but because the crowd might have overwhelmed him. He strutted across the grass like a prince. Kids petted him. Adults shook my hand. Someone even offered to make a little medal that read "Community Protector." I think he knew he was the star. He stood in the middle of the field for a while. Ears up, eyes bright, chewing a clover stem like he owned the place. When the sun finally dipped low and the lights began to flicker on across the street, I sat down with a paper plate full of food and looked around. Everything felt different yet. Familiar, a reset. The fences were still there, the lawn still trimmed, but the fear that once wrapped around the neighborhood like a tight belt had loosened. People had remembered how to be people again, and all it took was one rabbit guarding a hutch and one woman learning the hard way that control built on fear doesn't last long when folks decide enough is enough. The summer settled into a peaceful rhythm after everything with Karen faded into the background. The neighborhood had finally found its pulse again, steady and calm like it used to be. Mornings were filled with the sound of lawn sprinklers and birds instead of whispered complaints and nervous glances. Evenings brought porch lights flickering on, neighbors waving from driveways, and laughter that felt real, not forced. The invisible weight Karen had pressed on everyone for so long was gone, and nobody was in a rush to let it return. It amazed me how fast the place changed once people started trusting each other again. The rules were still there, but they felt like guidelines now, not threats. Hercules kept doing what he always did, lounging in the sun during the day, patrolling his corner of the yard at night like a king surveying his kingdom. He still had his hutch, which had become something of a landmark. People passing by would stop to admire him or bring their kids to see the famous guard rabbit. One of the neighbors even painted a little wooden sign that read, "Protected by Hercules," and hung it on the hutch fence. I didn't put it up for decoration. I left it there because it felt earned. One afternoon, I found myself sitting on the porch with a cold drink and watching the clouds roll over the trees when a moving truck rumbled down the street. It slowed as it approached the end of the block and came to a stop in front of Karen's house. I sat up a little, watching as two men in matching blue shirts started carrying boxes down the front step. Karen wasn't outside. I figured she might not want an audience. A few neighbors came out of their homes, watching from their yards or pretending to check the mail. No one said a word, but the silence said everything. We all knew what was happening. Karen was leaving. She didn't hold a yard sale. She didn't send a goodbye note. There were no waves, no tearful farewells, just boxes, a back door that opened and shut a few times, and eventually her car pulling out of the driveway without a glance back. Some said she was moving to a different neighborhood where the HOA rules were looser. Others claimed she was going to live near her sister in another state. Honestly, I didn't care where she went. What mattered was that she was gone. Not just physically, but symbolically. The spell she had cast over the community had been broken. After the truck left and the sun dipped low behind the rooftops, I walked over to her yard and took one last look at the place. The lawn had gone a little dry. The bird bath she used to clean every day was crusted with leaves and algae. The mailbox stood empty. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter, something like closure. Not every fight ends with a trophy. Sometimes the victory is simply a return to normal, to peace, to knowing you don't have to look over your shoulder anymore. A few days later, Linda and Earl hosted a community potluck in celebration of the new board's first official month. No speeches, no formalities, just tables full of food, folding chairs, and a whole lot of laughter. I brought sweet tea and a Thespate cooler of sodas. Hercules once again came along and laid under my chair, soaking in the shade and attention. Kids tossed a ball in the open field. Old neighbors chatted like they'd been friends for decades. It was the kind of gathering we hadn't had in years, one where nobody was worried about being cited for noise or parking too close to the curb. Linda raised a toast around sunset. Not to herself, not even to the board, but to the neighborhood. To the fact that we remembered who we were. That got the loudest cheer of the night. As the potluck wrapped up and folks began packing up chairs and bundling leftovers into foil trays, someone came over and asked if I was ever going to write about what happened. They said it was the kind of story people wouldn't believe unless they lived through it. I laughed and said, "Maybe one day." Then I looked down at Hercules and told them the hero of the story wasn't me. They patted my shoulder and said, "Maybe not, but I was the one who let him do his job." That counted too. In the weeks that followed, the hutch became even more popular. Someone painted a mural on the community clubhouse wall. A cartoonish version of Hercules with lightning bolts behind him, and the words "buck around and find out" underneath. It was all in good fun, but there was pride in it too. A kind of pride people had been too nervous to show before. The mural stayed up. No, one tried to paint over it. Not even the most by-the-book resident. With fall approaching, things settled into a gentle rhythm again. The leaves started to shift colors. The nights got cooler. I added extra hay to Hercules' hutch and fixed up a windbreak for the colder month. He had earned a warm spot through the winter. Sometimes I'd catch him staring off past the fence, like he remembered the chaos from earlier that summer. Or maybe he was just looking for clover. Either way, he didn't seem worried. Neither did I. One night, I walked out onto the porch just before bed. The yard was quiet. Crickets chirped. A soft breeze rustled the leaves. Hercules was in his usual spot, eyes half closed, ears twitching at distant sounds. I stood there for a while, just taking it in. This was more than a win over a petty neighbor. It was a reminder that community still mattered, that people could come together, that even when someone tried to rule with fear and control, there were still ways to push back without losing who you were. I took one last look at the hutch, the little wooden sign swaying in the wind, and felt something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. Not just the quiet kind, but the earned kind. The kind that comes after standing your ground, holding the line, and never letting go of what mattered most. Hercules gave a soft thump against the grass, then settled in for the night. I smiled and turned to head inside, knowing full well that no matter what happened next, this place, our place, was finally home.